Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Patricia Tony-Rubin, and I'm the director of the School of Early Childhood at George Brown College, and we are delighted you're here, and we are about to start our day. We will do so at first by beginning with the land acknowledgement.
Acknowledging land is something Indigenous people have been practicing for generations, long before settlers arrived. Recognizing the land you are on is an expression of respect and gratitude. OPSU Local 557 would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat, which is now home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is a treaty territory, a relationship between the Mississaugas of the Credit and Canada. This land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the land. Other Indigenous people, settlers, and newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This means we are all treaty people. As such, it is our responsibility to honor and respect this land and express gratitude for the opportunity to work on and share this land. All my relations. All my relations basically translates to we're all related. It's a reminder that everything in the universe is part of a single whole and is connected in some way to everything else. This means everything and everyone are our relatives, and that they have a purpose and are worthy of respect and care, especially the land and each other. Thank you, Miigwech, Walalyuk, all my relations.
Thank you. It's an exciting time for us to come together. A lot has been happening. The tragedy that we've been revealed of late speaks to so many things that need to be further unpacked, and we'll have an opportunity to do that today. This is our 17th Summer Institute and our first virtual one. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start by me introducing Ann Sato, and it's my privilege to do so. Ann Sato is president of George Brown College and is here to officially open the Institute. And Ann has been president of our college since 2004 and is planning, although there is much protest, to retire at the end of August. During this time, Ann has led with passion, commitment, and vision. And among many of her wonderful gifts to our college has been her commitment to early childhood. In fact, Ann has opened many of our summer institutes. Ann is a true champion for the importance of early years sector, for children and families it serves, and for the qualified workforce it requires. It's my privilege to welcome Ann Sato to officially kick off our Summer Institute. Oh dear.
I'm still muted, but now I'm unmuted. There you go. Thanks very much, Patricia, and welcome everyone. I'm certainly delighted to be part of the welcoming of all of you to our 17th Summer Institute on Early Childhood Development. I must tell you, though, that I'm also here with a very heavy heart after hearing the news that came out of Kamloops with the mass grave that was at the residential school there. And it's about children, and it's about just such travesty and such a terrible discovery. And I know that we're all undoubtedly still coming to grips with this, and there's much work to be done still to move forward. But I just had to say that just because it's weighing so heavily on me. But getting back to the matter at hand, and that is the Summer Institute. As many of you probably know, but this is an annual collaboration between the School of Early Childhood at George Brown and the Atkinson Centre for Society and Child Development at the University of Toronto's Ontario Institute for Studies and Education. And George Brown is very proud of this partnership, and the two institutions have nurtured this over many years, during which we've come together to support knowledge transfer and mobilization through numerous initiatives, and most importantly for me is moving research into policy and practice. Again, I'm sure everyone who's likely participating in this conference knows that when we support our children and families, we are able to tackle other public priorities, such as access to high quality childcare, which is so critical, supporting innovation, attracting and retaining a skilled workforce, improving educational outcomes, and promoting equity and diversity. All of us here and in countries around the world have been shaken by the COVID-19 pandemic. I know that at the college we have seen firsthand the significant impact the pandemic has had on our communities, our students, our staff, and their families. And I know you've all seen that. We've also seen the many remarkable ways that the 150 educators working in our 12 lab schools have come together to support children and their families under these very stressful conditions. And I know you join me in recognizing these educators and all educators in our sector who have been absolutely extraordinary during these times. So a personal thank you. I know my grandchildren are in early childhood centers, and I don't know how their parents and how the whole family would have managed without that. Now this year, Institute, as always, has a fabulous program planned, examining this year the impact of the pandemic on early childhood education and the care sector, including issues of equity and the infrastructure necessary to support recovery, and also lays the groundwork for building a strong future. We're delighted that we'll be joined by Canadian and international experts in identifying challenges, proposing the solutions to building and sustaining high quality early education. So on behalf of the George Brown team and our colleagues at the Atkinson Centre, we wish you productive deliberations over the next few days. I look forward to the next set of discussions, and thank you all again for joining us for this conference or institute. Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And we are going to miss you. Your contribution, you know, you can feel George Brown all over the city of Toronto, and we know that that has a great deal to do with you. So thank you. Good luck. I know we're going to get you back for many exciting things in the future, so don't go too far away. But my name is Carrie McQuaig. I am a fellow in early childhood policy at the Atkinson Centre at the University of Toronto, and just gave you the whole view of what it is and what we do. But my job today is I have the enviable position of introducing our panelists, and it is a very impressive lineup. I'm just going to give you a little overview. They're going to speak for about 12 minutes each. Their PowerPoints or their presentations will be on your screen. On the bottom of the screen that you have, you'll see something called a Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments for the panelists, type them in there, and then we'll make sure that they get to the appropriate person to answer. So keep that in mind. Do not use your chat function, use your Q&A function. So our first speaker of the day is Dawn Desjardins. She is the Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist of the RBC Royal Bank. And Dawn has been with the bank as an economist since 2006. And she is responsible for, you know, really what happens with the economy. Quite seriously, she has a great grasp of the economic forces and how the pandemic is impacting the economy. But today she's going to talk to us more in depth about the impact of the pandemic on women, and particularly women who are mothers of young children. Our second speaker is Nicole Ineese-Nash, and she is a research associate with Ryerson University. And Nicole is an Anishinaabe scholar and educator. She got her undergraduate degree from Ryerson, and she is now a doctoral student at OISE. And like all very, very busy people, Nicole is the director and founder of Finding Our Power Together, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit organization supporting youth in realizing their own goals. And our third speaker for this morning will be Karen Gray, who many of you will know from her decades of work at the City of Toronto promoting early childhood education. She is there as the Director of Service System Planning and Policy Development. We just went through, those of us at George Brown and the Atkins Center just went through a very interesting process with Karen and her team and doing an evaluation of the city's childcare programs, which was very illuminating. Look for it on our website. I think there is a lot of lessons that we can learn from it, particularly as we are in the pandemic and as we move out of the pandemic. So I'm going to end it there. Keep in mind your Q&A, and we'll begin with Dawn.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you so much for inviting me to attend. A real pleasure and looking forward to learning a lot. So I do have some slides here today that I'd like to use to go through the material. I think it'd just be helpful for you as you can see some of the lines that I'm thinking about. As we all know, COVID-19 has been an extraordinary event, in particular for the labor market. In March and April of 2020, we did see almost 3 million Canadians lose their job. And in particular, we saw a greater percentage of women. In fact, the participation rate for women fell to its lowest level in 30 years. Now, that was the low point in terms of the labor market impact and really the economic impact. However, even as we've recovered, we still have not seen a complete recovery in terms of job creation. There's still about 500,000 Canadians who were working before the pandemic who aren't working today. And about 65% of those Canadians are women. Now, on our next slide, I was always thinking of these 500,000 people as being newly unemployed. But you can certainly see that we have seen a significant increase in the number of people who have migrated from being unemployed for a short period of time to actually being what is considered to be long-term unemployed. And long-term unemployed is about 27 weeks, or just over half a year, having no employment. And these numbers have picked up significantly. Now, you can see historically men have always had higher levels of longer-term unemployment than women, but in both cases, they have increased substantially during this crisis. And is, of course, very concerning when we see people out of work for a long period of time, because there is the risks to their skills. Could they atrophy? Do they lose their networks? So it is something we really have to be monitoring. Well, when we look at the next slide, we see why, some people may have lost their jobs. COVID-19 has had a very uneven impact on the economy. Services sector, where you need to have close contact, those are the industries that were most significantly hurt by the economic decline, but certainly the job decline. And even as we have gone through these several periods of reopening, reclosing, all of that happening, we certainly have seen these people in the services sector, whether it's in food and accommodation services, whether it is in travel or in retail. And these are industries where we have more women making up those labor market entrants or workers. Now, when we think about the other side of the equation, we also have industries like education and healthcare, where women are much more likely to be working than men, and those jobs have largely come back. But what is of concern here, of course, is these very hard hit industries. We have to think about the economy as having changed significantly during this pandemic. And we're not exactly sure if all of these jobs are going to be recovered. We think about retail as an example. E-commerce platforms have cropped up everywhere, and probably going to see many of those e-commerce platforms continuing to exist. So will we need as many people working in retail? In travel, we're all itchy to get traveling. But when we think about business travel, which is another large portion of that industry, are we going to see that demand pick up significantly? These meetings we're having on Zoom and on WebEx, some of these are going to persist. So what kind of demand? And what about all those service workers who support people in office towers? The idea that we will see hybrid models of working emerge, that will put in jeopardy some of those positions. The one thing we looked at in the past is automation. And I think of it sometimes when we were talking about automation in the past, we were thinking about a decade out, but it happened probably in 10 months. And when we looked at it in the past, we did discover that women, of the 1/3 of jobs that we felt were highly automatable, over 50% were being performed by women. So women were already at risk of being automated. So we have to see how we can transition these women back into the labor force. Well, the next slide is another one that I think is also interesting, because when we think about women and working, many women have to work at more than one job. They outpace men in terms of being multiple job owners at a rate of 1.5, so 1.5 to 1. So that's certainly something too we have to be thinking about, as these people have many jobs that they have in fact lost. Well, the next slide is really showing us who we were trying to determine, like, who's being hurt. What are some of the common characteristics? And in fact, what we see is that women who are working in these industries typically are working at the low end of the wage scale. Higher wage workers, in fact, you can see here both men and women, we've actually seen jobs being created. They are working in professional, scientific, technical services, in finance, insurance, and real estate. And the job losses, again, as I said, at the lower end, and the more person-to-person industries where you really can't be working remotely. Well, another common characteristic on the next slide is that it is younger workers who have seen a significant drop in their employment. And young women in particular, they've underperformed all segments. Now, one positive development on this front is that we've seen a growing percentage of these young women going into post-secondary school education or continuing their post-secondary education. StatsCan just put out some data recently, and they said that young women's participation increased to 32% at the start of the school year in 2020 into 2021. That was up from 29% the previous year. And that compares, and this is another area that people are watching, is young men, because young men's participation post-secondary really leveling off at 23%. And on slide 7, this is what we're seeing. It's important for future workers. When we look at who is being left behind, it is tending to be workers who have lower levels of education. More highly educated workers, we've seen jobs being created. And of course, these higher level of education workers, a lot more of them can in fact work remotely. In April, 5.1 million Canadians work from home, and 2/3 of those normally would be in offices or in different situations. So definitely, this education is something we have to keep an eye on. Well, on the next slide, I guess is the one that perhaps pertains most to today's conversation, because we were looking at job losses, whether you had a child or not. And what we saw for low-income mothers in particular, they have by and large lost jobs. They've lost more jobs than women without children. And even higher income mothers have been on balance losing jobs. So that's certainly something that is quite telling, I would say. Now, The next slide is looking at not just are they not working, but have they actually decided to remove themselves from the labor force? And when you can see that, you can see on this chart that in fact, a greater number of mothers than fathers have in fact taken themselves completely out of the labor market. And the last slide we have here is really just showing you in aggregate overall, when we're thinking about the labor market and what's been happening. And this has been a persistent statistic we've been watching throughout this entire pandemic. And what it shows us is that women, to a much greater degree, and in the most recent data showing us, in fact, women leaving the labor market, yet men coming into the labor market. And those numbers, as you can imagine, bounce around month to month, but that has been a very common theme. Women have tended to step aside, while, of course, we have seen men sometimes out of the labor market, but in general, it's always been fewer men leaving compared to women, and in the current situation, actually men entering. So definitely when we think about the pandemic and its impact on women and the work, we look at statistics showing us that there's been a decline in the number of children in childcare. So the data I saw said 52% in 2020. That was down from 60% in 2019. And I thought what was interesting was the reasons people are taking their kids out of childcare. Well, some of it, as you expect, some people are leaving the labor force, as I've shown you, so staying home. Some people are on mat leave, and some people say, given how their situation has changed, the cost is just too prohibitive. But the pandemic has also created significantly higher concern about safety, and people said they had decided to withdraw their children from childcare because of the unpredictability of when waves of viruses would come through, whether or not they would be able to access that childcare or not, simply because of what was happening on the health side of the situation. Well, as we all know, women, really do perform a greater share of unpaid work, about 60%, according to a lot of surveys. And, a 2020 UN study said you can attribute this unequal division of unpaid family labor as contributing to just general inequality, less labor market participation. It reduces even the time that women are able to work. We see many more women working part-time compared to men. We have negative impacts on wages. Sometimes if you're part-time, it's harder to get to that promotion, that next stage, and get those wage. And so the quality of your job may be a little bit less. And of course, it does contribute to mental and health stress. So our work has concentrated, on the impact of the pandemic on women's labor force. What are the factors that are causing this uneven development for these women? And so I look forward to hearing from Nicole and Karen more about what's going on in other segments of our labor market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawn. And just a reminder to participants that all of the panelists' presentation will be posted on the Atkinson website at the end of the Summer Institute. So rest assured that those great statistics that Dawn shared with you, you will have access to them. Our next speaker is Nicole. Welcome, Nicole.
Hi, thank you for having me. Just give me 1 second to open up my presentation here. All right. I think I just want to take a moment and do things a little bit differently. So I want to welcome everyone to just settle in and into the space that we're in here. I know it's a virtual environment. It's a lot different than being in person. And, the things that I would like to talk about really stem from, our heart knowledge and from our spiritual energy that is really hard to transmit in an online format. So, and to be fair, I actually just need this moment myself. So I would like to encourage you, if you'd like to just take a few deep breaths together in this space. You can close your eyes if that feels comfortable to you. And as you breathe, I wonder if you can just switch gears and think about your body and its space. In particular, I wonder if you can feel your feet on the floor and see if you might be able to imagine the ground that is beneath your feet and the earth that's beneath that ground. And see, even still, if you could think about everything that that ground has seen and experienced in its time on this earth. With that in mind, I'd like to speak today about how we might walk on that earth, maybe a little more gently, and how that knowledge of our mother, the earth, can actually inform the way that we care and teach young children. So if you're ready to come back to this space, you might open your eyes, give your body a little shake. So I had a whole presentation planned, and I still am planning to go through that presentation. But as was shared at the beginning of this panel, I feel as though I'm unable to speak about equity when, you know, the situation of our world is not an equitable place. You know, the devastating news about the residential school children being found in Kamloops is very heartbreaking. And, you know, my community and several other Indigenous communities are in a process of collective mourning right now. And so I want to make space for that. And also, you know, this is an opportunity for us as people who are interested in supporting children and families and communities to really take stock of what situations we are inadvertently, you know, participating in particular, you know, thinking about education as being founded on the inequity, our country being founded on the inequity, the stealing of Indigenous lands, the murdering of Indigenous people. And that's really hard to reconcile. And I'm not sure that it's even possible to reconcile. But I would like to potentially share what I think might be some reconciliatory or restorative frameworks for us to begin to embed into our practices as we begin to open up, or as we begin to seek restoration. I think COVID-19 has had significant impacts on everyone, but disproportionately on marginalized peoples, racialized peoples, and Indigenous peoples. This also means that it's an opportunity for us to make significant change. So I'd like to share some things that I think might be helpful in potentially changing the way that we engage in these conversations. My work is really around land-centered processes as they relate to Indigenous communities, and particularly youth. As was shared in my introduction, I am the co-founder and director of an organization called Finding Our Power Together. And Finding Our Power Together is a suicide prevention program or a life promotion program that was started, you know, in collaboration with youth who are experiencing significant suicides in their community. And as COVID has continued to, you know, exacerbate the social conditions that create inequity, we have seen an increase in suicides, an increase in mental health crises, and an increase in just social isolation as experienced by Indigenous young people, particularly those in remote First Nation communities where the little services that they, you know, potentially had became inaccessible. And so really, I think the intervention that we can begin to put into practice is actually acknowledging and being in relation to the lands on which we live and work. And so my work is really, you know, attempting to understand how land ontologies and land-based practices can be, can inform the ways that we actually organize and participate in education of young children, but also in all of the social systems that we have come to know. Because, you know, COVID has really changed the way that we interact, I also believe this to be a very important time in our collective history that can bring about potential new possibilities. And so I'd like to present what I think could be a more equitable and inclusive approach. So I've come to this work as someone who has worked in early childhood, particularly with Indigenous children and families. And really, I was always impressed by the ways that early childhood educators really prioritize care at the core of our practice. And for me, that really aligned with my Indigenous values of centering love. And so ethics of care really are a helpful framework for us to begin to think about ethics and ethical engagement, and really to center our ideological frameworks of care. And in a way that doesn't necessitate us to assume that those are the only frameworks of care that matter or that are appropriate. Really, I think it's about us being aware that we do hold our own ideological positionings, and those ideological positionings are not always benevolent. You know, when we think about the residential school system, those ethics that went into creating those systems might have been benevolent and obviously did not end that way. And so I think thinking about our ethics of care is really important about how we decide to design and facilitate programs and systems for children and families, and whether or not we were doing that in the best interest of those people. And to understand that not everybody follows the same frameworks or ideological positionings that we might. From an Indigenous perspective, you know, we really focus on ethical responsibility. And it's interesting to be thinking about this right now, because I think a lot of our communities are actually returning to this type of engagement of actually prioritizing social welfare and collective welfare over individual gain and individual well-being. But also that, you know, we're actually becoming more related to land. We're going back to the land. Many of our communities have, you know, shuttered their borders and have actually increased their access to land-based programs and cultural programs as a result of COVID-19. But I wanted to share a few of sort of what I believe to be Indigenous concepts as they might inform the ways that we decide to engage in the future. In particular, Indigenous conceptualizations of ethical engagement really think about all of creation as being part of our networks. In that video of that land acknowledgement, that all my relations really extends to not only the people in our lives, but also to the non-human entities, the plants, the waters, all of Earth entirely. And that means that we actually have ethical responsibilities, not only to human actors, but also to all of creation. And these relational understandings allow for us to make decisions on the behalf of more than just us, and actually include restorative justice frameworks. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more because I think right now we're in a time where reconciliation has been on the agenda for 5 or 6 years, and really not much has been reconciled. Of the 94 calls to action, there's only been 5 that have actually been implemented by the Government of Canada. And rather than using reconciliation as a framework, I think using restorative justice as a framework might be more helpful here, and actually is a process that we can all engage in rather than maybe passing the buck to the government or assuming that we have no implications in reconciliation or restoration. Restorative justice is really a process whereby we decide as a community to do better, where we hold people accountable and where we have high expectations for one another. And so I would like to invite you all to think about your own implications in colonization, in the devastation of our lands and territories, in the genocide of Indigenous peoples. We all benefit from those systems today. And in order for us to move forward, we need to take stock, take accountability, and change our behavior. And that requires us to engage in ongoing reflexivity and to really restore our own presence here as being a part of that story, the colonial story. Usually I would talk about what land teaches about care, and I'd be happy to talk about that later. But I do want to give some maybe tangible takeaways here. I apologize, I'm a little emotional today, more so than I would normally be. But I do want to provide some maybe takeaway actions. One of those things that I think are really important to how we engage in restorative justice and how we engage in equitable care for children and families in the early years is about what Fikile Numalo calls refiguring presences. And really that's about, when we are engaging with children, we need to refigure, we need to actually bring into the present the fact that Indigenous peoples are still here, that they were here, that our lands are actually Indigenous lands, and that needs to become embedded into our culture, into Canadian culture, and not in a reconciliatory kind of framework, but in an actual critical reflective framework. Also, decolonizing and indigenizing pedagogies are helpful in the terms of changing the ways that we do things. In particular, decolonization calls us to take tangible action and to remove structures of oppression. And so I encourage everyone to think about that in their own practices. How are we implicit in colonization ongoing today? And also centering land. Land-based experiential learning is a way that we can actually bring everyone's story, bring everyone's experience, and actually hold on to that tension and that complexity within the classroom in a place where we can sort of explore that complexity. Really, I just think we need to start getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, and as uncomfortable as it might be to talk about oppression, to talk about racial injustice, to talk about land dispossession and the erasure of Indigenous people and the labor of Black people in this territory. We need to be doing that. We need to be doing better. I'll leave it there for now. Miigwech.
We do have a great deal. We do have a great deal to think about and to reconcile. And I know that we were all horrified by the discovery in Kamloops, but really shouldn't have been surprised. I mean, we know what residential schools did. So yeah, what did we think we were going to discover? Again, thank you for that. Karen, could you take us through to the end where our audience can then interact with us?
Sure. I thought I would take this time to discuss what we know about well-being of children and families using the Raising the Village data and the importance that this data has in addressing COVID and our recovery. We know that there are inequities, and I just want to say that I know that there are some participants who are not from the city of Toronto, but please do not think that this is a Toronto only story. We heard from Dawn around the inequities in the labor market, and we just heard from Nicole, who told us about the inequities experienced by the Indigenous community. So take the information that I'm going to present and think broadly within your own community. So by way of background, Raising the Village is an initiative of the Toronto Child and Family Network. This is a network made up of broad representation. It's co-chaired by the City of Toronto as well as the Ontario government. It consists of childcare, developmental services, child welfare, school boards, Indigenous-led organizations, and many more. This collective works together to improve quality access and seamless service pathways so that children and families in Toronto experience well-being. The vision is that all children and families in Toronto experience well-being, and its mission is to mobilize the systems intersections that improve child and family well-being in Toronto. In order to meet the vision and the mission, the network needed a baseline of well-being for children and families in the city of Toronto. So we came up with 6 child outcomes, 5 family outcomes, and 5 outcomes for the Indigenous community. These were developed by researchers, by the community, educators, academics. Within each of those outcomes, we have 120 indicators. And the Raising the Village allows you to see well-being measured by these indicators by neighborhood, race, and gender. If you could just hold the slide, please. So can you go back one? Inequities by outcomes. Great, great. So here you see a breakdown of child outcomes. We're looking at physical health, development, mental health, social development, learning and education, rights and opportunities, and nurture and care. In the family outcomes, we're looking at data around family health, resilience and support, lifelong learning, financial security, and culture and community. In the Indigenous outcomes consists of self-knowledge, strong families, vibrant communities, cultural equity, and self-determination. So when we're looking at an outcome of physical health and development, the outcome is children are born healthy and reach their optimal physical and development. Learning and education speaks to children are engaged and curious learners, gain knowledge and skills, and have educational success. In this domain, we're looking at indicators around worrying about going to school. Do children have enough support? Are families reading to their children? Nurture and care outcomes indicators include feelings of safety. The key piece of Raising the Village is the establishment of an equity analysis toolkit. All of this data comes from the TDSB student census. So TDSB represents 70% of children in the city of Toronto. So it's a good population measure. The analysis toolkit provides disaggregated data from the indicators used in Raising the Village that's broken down by population groups. The toolkit provides a deeper understanding of the factors that impact children's well-being. When data is reported for the city's population as a whole, that data can hide important differences in the experiences of particular groups. By using data that is broken down by socio-demographic groups, it's possible to more effectively target resources at populations that need them the most. And this is critical when we're dealing with COVID, because we keep hearing that there are inequities. COVID has exposed these inequities. This gives us the opportunity to actually see where the inequities are and prepare for exacerbated inequities. So when I talked about population as a whole, for example, in learning and education, we have an indicator that speaks to belonging to school data. At a population as a whole, kids are faring fairly well. But when you break it down in terms of gender, it shows that 69% of students said they felt like they belonged all the time. When drilled down by gender, the data tells us a different story. 71% of straight students said they belong. They had a sense of belonging. However, LGBTQ students reported 45% feeling safe and belonging. And those students that are questioning their gender felt they belonged only 50% of the time. So you can see it's important to drill down into gender and race. And so I will ask you to go to the next one, just so that we can see what the equity analysis tool, this is just a really quick snapshot. This allows us to look at the inequities by race. So I just scrolled up and did students' race. You can do it by gender, socioeconomic, there's a whole bunch of factors, but this one I just did by students' race. So you can see most positive is the blue. And I don't know if you can see the whole screen. In my screen, it's cut off, but you can see that white students in the area of 8 hours of sleep, active transportation, good self-rated physical health, experience positive outcome. And then the orange are those student groups by race that experience the least positive outcome in these areas. And I think it's important to take it out of the Toronto context. This is the experience of our Black, Indigenous, and equity deserving communities. This is an Ontario story. You will see this everywhere where you have a diverse population. And I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to develop, be intentional in our service delivery design. Next slide, please. You hear on the news around hot spots, high rates of infection, and you can see we also have a neighborhood inequities scale. The inequity score is a composite of various measures. It measures low, and they're weighted. So low income measure, parental unemployment, low parental education, no knowledge of official language, core housing need. The 2016 inequity score, which I'm showing here, can be considered in combination with the population of children 0 to 12 in a particular neighborhood. So where you have high concentration, and that would be the darker colors, the darker zones, those are the communities that are experiencing the highest inequities. So if you're providing service in those areas, you need to look at a more intentional approach, because these families do not have the same access to services as the rest of the city of Toronto. The neighborhoods also with the highest inequities prior to COVID are also the same neighborhoods with the highest infection rates. So what I'm trying to tell in this story is we had inequities in the city of Toronto. We have inequities in Ontario. We have inequities in the country. And so they follow the COVID results. That's not new. And I think this gives us, it should, with the data, it should then drive action. With data, you can't ignore it. You have to act. And I thought that this was a good example of that. Next slide, please. So the inequities and COVID. So as I mentioned, the Toronto Public Health COVID risk data suggests that neighborhoods with high COVID-19 mirror neighborhoods with high inequities, where low income, employment status, and racial backgrounds are all intersecting. COVID impacts on family employment, remote work arrangements, virtual schooling, and health and safety concerns seem to also be disproportionately impacting equity deserving groups. So what do we know about the impacts of COVID? In November, we surveyed parents and found that 50% of respondents reported not working or experiencing a change in employment. 42% of those reported with a fee subsidy reported that they were unsure if they would return to childcare. And 66% of those families reported their concerns around health and safety. We've also seen a higher number of families in these areas opt out of in-person schooling, which impacts enrollment in our school age programs. So in those high inequity areas, we're also seeing families choosing for virtual programming. In the city of Toronto, we currently are running at a 54% vacancy rate. I work with the Ontario OMSA, Ontario Social Service Municipal Associations. And so I do speak to my colleagues across the 47 municipalities who are responsible for childcare. This is not a Toronto story. This is an Ontario story. We're looking at half vacancy rates across all of Ontario. We have experienced, and certainly you who are on this webinar today certainly have experienced rolling closures, and we know the impact of that. Dawn was talking about, the cost of childcare. Should you return? Now you have to isolate, then you're coming back, as well as the infection rates of our staff working in childcare. Childcare needs are directly related to employment, and with a drop in women's labor force participations, we're seeing a corresponding drop in childcare enrollment. And currently in the city of Toronto, only 58% of families requiring a fee subsidy have returned. So we're sitting with, almost half of fee subsidies available. And prior to the pandemic, 64% of families receiving a fee subsidy were lone parent families. So you can see that how the pandemic will exacerbate employment and return to childcare. We are also acutely aware of the impact on childcare staff working during the pandemic, and that I mentioned that, you yourself are exposed and you yourself have experienced COVID or had to isolate. Next slide, please. So I thought I would share some of the findings from the Ontario Parent Survey. Again, it talks about inequities, but it also now is talking about the impact on mental health of our families and children. So if you looked at the data and you looked at the indicators around mental health, you'll see that there are concerns around mental health, and they're heightened by race and they're heightened by inequities. Now we're going to add COVID to all of this. We're seeing that 1 in 3 parents or caregivers reported a moderate to high level of anxiety, and almost 60% reported symptoms that met the criteria for depression. That's alarming. And it's clear that early childcare and early years programs are critical services to redress the impact of these inequities. You can see parents are also reported difficulty in managing children's behaviors. 40% of parents are reporting child mood, behavior. There's family dysfunction. They also have a stat that 2.5 Black, Indigenous, people of color are more likely than their white peers to be afraid to go outside. So you can see that coming back to childcare, going back to school is going to be different. Children and their families will be returning, whether it's infant, toddler, preschool programs and filling those vacancies, or the reopening of schools and school age. Children and their families are coming back with heightened impacts of COVID. And I also just want to recognize that, for early childhood educators that are on the line today, you too are a part of this. You have to manage, you're working, you're exposed to COVID, you have children at home, you might be exposed to virtual learning. It has not gone unnoticed, the impacts of early childhood educators. So the next slide. So this is about building equity in the Toronto childcare system. What are some of the initiatives that we've put in place to address the inequities as we support the childcare system? So we have clear data on the inequities families experience in the city. We also have a call to address these inequities experienced by Black, Indigenous, racialized, and equity deserving families. So now is the time to be intentional around the programming that we provide. And we have been intentional at the City of Toronto as we support the childcare system during this pandemic. I just want to say that Children's Services, to help guide the recovery, identified 3 priority areas to align resources to meet the needs of families and the sector. And these include access, workforce, and financial stability. In Toronto, we know we have had to maintain the high quality system that we have. We were worried at a time when, March 13th and everybody was shuttered in. We were very concerned about the impact this would have on the childcare system, and we certainly did not want to lose the gains that we had made in the system. We were able to grow the system. We have a very high quality program in Toronto, and we know the families are going to come back. So what could we do to just keep the system stable? So for families, we certainly use a lot of flexibility to help families stay in care. We continue to use this exceptional circumstances. The goal is not to ask people to leave. The goal is to keep families who choose childcare, keep them in childcare. We also had access to federal funding, the federal restart funding, as well as we were able to reinvest our some of our provincial allocations. So we were able to do that. We gave all the childcare centers a portion of the funding, lots of flexibility, address the needs that you need to within the provincial guidelines. But on top of that, we looked at our high inequity areas, the areas where we had higher COVID risk, and we targeted those areas and we provided additional support because we knew that in those areas with high COVID, they also required additional supports to address that. We've also looked at our early on locations in high inequitable communities, and we've offered them the opportunity, and they've taken it up, to purchase iPads so that families can participate. If you're not in childcare, you can participate in a virtual child and family experience. There's online programming. The quality assurance program for those people in Toronto, have been suspended. We've shifted that training to focus more on communities of practice to support the workforce. And I think, there's over 200 childcare programs who have registered. So that just shows you, even in COVID, this workforce of early childhood educators are still interested in professional development. We've had to look at our fee subsidy administration and our wait lists. We've made many changes. We've expanded some of our job search, again, with the intent of keeping families in care. But then we've also gone out to our community clusters, and we have community clusters that have been developed to address the unique needs of those families who are living in these COVID inequitable areas that I just spoke about. So there's community clusters. We're educating families around the value of childcare to encourage them to come to enroll in childcare. We've created education videos with Toronto Public Health. I'm sure many of you have seen them. They provide an awareness for families of what to expect when you enroll your child into childcare, particularly now when families can't enter the building. So we developed these videos so that families can actually watch the video, can be rest assured. Health and safety is first and foremost, but quality childcare is available, and it's front and center. For the childcare sector, we provided health and safety training. I know lots of you, before you could open your doors, you went through a series of public health training that we worked with public health on. We continue to provide videos and support around health and safety. We are looking at resources. Well, we have provided resources around mental health, but now we're looking at an additional series on how we can support the workforce. And since April, we've directed resources towards vaccine education to the workforce, and we've targeted some of those high COVID neighborhoods, and we've addressed vaccine hesitancy. So as you can see, there's been a lot of concerted effort to support and maintain the early years sector, with a priority on addressing the inequities some of our families experience. Next slide. I just want to say in closing, I just want to thank everyone in the childcare sector. I do believe that the impacts of this pandemic would have been far greater if it wasn't for you. What we should take away from this presentation is that moving forward, our system and programs will change. As we see in this presentation, the children returning to childcare are returning with significant mental health complexities. But with this data, we can provide a more targeted and responsive program that provides the supports they need for their recovery. There's brighter days ahead, though. I know this has sounded like a doom and gloom, but there are brighter days ahead, and even brighter with the announcement in the federal budget of a $30 billion investment to develop a national childcare plan. We are hoping that this, with the heightened importance of early childhood educators and childcare, that we'll be able to, as our city manager says, build back better. creating a childcare system that allows more families to access childcare, that makes childcare affordable, and a commitment to addressing wages in the workforce. So with that, I will end there.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you to all of the panelists. And I want you to know that in the Q&A, there have been a number of thank yous and congratulations on your presentation. And some of the questions that had to do with the unequal impact of COVID on Black, Indigenous, and families of color. Karen, you answered many of those questions in your presentation. So the next question, though, is for Nicole. And one of the ways that public policy expresses inequities is in the unequal allocation of funding. And when it came to federal early childhood programs or any federal programming for children, these have essentially been frozen since 1995. And even during the Martin Child Care Plan of 2005, Indigenous programs were not included. So there appears to be, I want to, take off from Karen's last point about, the hope we all have in the promised investment coming out of budget 2021 with dedicated funding for Indigenous programming for Indigenous children. So I guess I'm going to ask you, Nicole, is it enough? Is it enough to catch up for over 20 years of underfunding Indigenous children's programming?
No. Short answer is no. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that is a very big issue when it comes to supporting Indigenous futurities. We see that, Indigenous people are the only demographic that has an apartheid system when it comes to education and health services. And that tiered system really creates inequities in the system itself and also in the production of quality. So we see that, Indigenous communities are very much capable of developing and maintaining their own systems of education, of healthcare, of governance, and are never provided with the opportunities and with the resources to enact their perspectives in a sort of sustainable and long-term way. What I, like to say in regards to that, though, is that we do have a large number of Indigenous people who are in Toronto, a large number of people who are in our urban centers. And so it's not to say that the funding issue isn't a really great issue. It is a very great issue, but also that we need to start thinking about how provincial systems and municipal systems can actually enact policy, enact pedagogies that really do support Indigenous families and not rely solely on federal funding or not rely solely on this sort of tiered system. I think when we're thinking about equity, we need to start creating systems that actually address the issues of everyone and are pushing us towards doing better in a collective sense. I think what happens right now, and I think this is changing, but I think what has happened as a result of reconciliation is that people sometimes feel that they don't want to touch Indigenous education or they don't want to be involved because it's very complicated. And it is very complicated. And that is part of the work. The work is to sit in that complexity, to be uncomfortable, to ask questions, to engage communities, and to actually start creating systems that don't rely on this tiered model in the first place.
Thank you. Karen, do you want to add a little bit on how the city is addressing this issue and what plans you may have for the upcoming federal dollars?
Well, I think it's too early to talk about the federal dollars yet, but I do want to say that, what Nicole said, we had an opportunity, money was flowed from the province to invest in the Indigenous community. And so the City of Toronto, recognizing self-governance, gave the planning and the funding to TASK in the city of Toronto. And we have 6 additional programs that are busting. They are fully enrolled. We have the Native Child, what is it, Indian, so what is, the one on Spadina. I'm so embarrassed. The Native Cultural Center, sorry, my apologies. They're doing language. So they have language teachers. And because it's virtual, that has expanded across Canada. From my understanding, very unique program, very few language teachers. Land-based, certainly we have a lot of gardens in community. They have been protected through the municipality, be able to create food, and additional 4 early on centers throughout the community. And those early on centers are full. And I would say being virtual, the Indigenous community has increased participation. It's easier to participate virtually, and we're seeing high numbers. And I think, through that success of having the Indigenous community plan for their needs, tell us how much that's going to cost. And we just worked as a conduit to put through the application to the province. So I'm really hoping with the federal dollars, we'll be able to use that same process, because I think it's worked really well in the city of Toronto.
Thank you, Karen. And as we know, childcare is one part of a whole ecosystem that we have to make up for historic injustices. The second question is, and this is to the panel as a whole, is this isn't our first pandemic. It's not likely to be our last. And the safety concerns that parents have are legitimate. And they're particularly legitimate when we look at the way that this pandemic has affected our seniors in long-term care homes. And there we saw a marked difference between outcomes, death rates, sickness rates, between providers who were corporate, in the corporate sector, and the nonprofit and public. And now that there's going to be, substantial new public funding for childcare, we're seeing a lot of corporate interest coming forward, wanting to get involved in the childcare business. So just your thoughts on that. Is there a role for profit making in childcare? And I'm going to let you go first again, Karen. And I know you hate me for this question, but it's one that has to be.
Yeah. I was chuckling, wondering who was going to get this first. Well, I think the City of Toronto has made it quite clear in 2005 with their council directive that any new funding is to be preserved for the nonprofit sector. I think the community of early childhood educators in the nonprofit and public sector have advocated very well and demonstrated the difference of quality as a cornerstone to addressing, inequities in the system. They made it quite clear. So we have a directive. I don't know, at the end of the day, it will be interesting. Carrie, you provided some information to the City of Toronto around Quebec. And I think we see the same. There is an expansion in the commercial sector, even though we don't put in public dollars. So I do think it's a real concern that if we're not able to meet the demand from families will be found outside of the public nonprofit sector. So it is a concern, but we do in the City of Toronto have a directive not to put any public dollars into new commercial operators. So that's a safeguard.
Dawn, would you like to address the issue?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on any of this as you are. But I do think, just when you think about it from the economic point of view, that is what happens, right? If companies see the ability to fulfill rather a need you do see expansion of the private side of the equation. Now, that's not to say that, you know, it all takes time, of course, right? I mean, it's great that we've got this plan and that's good, but you know, it's going to take time to create spaces. And I would think to create the workforce to be able to handle that. I don't know. I was actually thinking of this question myself, Karen. So you may not like you're getting questioned now from the other panelists, but like, what kind of demand on the labor side are you seeing? What kind of shortfalls do you think are out there in terms of having people who have the credentials, which this is all about? Like, how many more positions could be created over the next 3 years just to be able to meet the demand that's likely to evolve?
Well, just saying that the early childhood workforce across Canada is about 200,000,
Right.
and to meet the demand at today's levels, and in many cases those levels are there's too many children being cared for by too few educators. But even to just replicate what we have and reach the goals that the federal government has set in the budget would take another 200,000. But what we do find is that there are many in the early, who have qualifications who have left the sector because it's not a good job, right?
Right.
But when good jobs are offered, they come back. So this will be the deciding factor. Not only will we have more childcare, but will it be good childcare, and will it be a good place to work? Nicole, do you have any thoughts on the question of for-profit in childcare?
Yeah, I think again, it creates tiered systems, and tiered systems provide choice for sure, and families do want choice a lot of times, but I believe that it does continue to exacerbate the inequities that we already see in the public sector. So particularly Indigenous, immigrant families, families who might have children with disabilities or special needs, Black families, like they might not be able to access for-profit childcare. And like you say, like, ECEs in the field might be drawn to for-profit systems because they're largely, there's more money involved, and they might have better benefits, and it might be more secure in terms of their employment. And so you will continue to have a tiered system where, highly educated early childhood educators, might be in a for-profit system, which might largely be a white dominated system, a Eurocentric system, and a system that it continues to replicate a particular way of knowing and being, without centering care, without centering love, without centering the actual human connection that we need to have in order for us to build a thriving and well society. And so, yeah, for me, I think choice is choice. But like Karen said, for us to think about, the way that public money is spent should be on public systems, not on for-profit systems.
Yes, and just, with the information that we now have, I mean, we sort of find across the board that, in fact, it's by far the public system which pays better and offers better benefits, and actually allows educators to practice their profession, because a lot of the complaints in the workforce is that they don't get to practice their profession because they need to clean, and they need to transport kids, they need to do all those things, that keeps an under-resourced system going. So
Karen,
we have a...
Sorry, can I just add to this conversation?
Yes.
Because we have a chronic issue around wages in this sector, right? It's chronic. And certainly the City of Toronto has been advocating, same with the other municipalities, around increasing wages. So when we talk about wages and when we talk about the commercial sector, what's concerning is these publicly traded companies that are now coming in, and they're investigating. $30 billion is a lot. You can give a lot to your shareholders if you can get into that game. So let's just talk about wages and publicly traded program or centers. If the budget is 80% wages and you have a public traded company who has to provide returns to its shareholders, you have to reduce wages in order to provide profits, right? So I just want to throw that on the table because there's a lot more in play when you talk about commercial operators. It's the impact it has on wages, and we need to be committed to increasing wages in this sector. Sorry for interrupting, Carrie.
No, that's an important, that's a vital point. When we look at that at across the country, the average or the median wage, sorry, is about $19 an hour. In many places, educators are making the minimum wage. And quite frankly, Ontario, with its $2 an hour top up, providing you don't make too much money, doesn't compare with what other jurisdictions are doing. For example, the Yukon just put in where they're topping up educators' wages by $17.11 an hour. So they're really taking on some public responsibility for what educators make. That's on top of what the operators are supposed to be paying them. We have a question from Jerry, who is asking whether there are any statistics either from the Raising the Village study or others on Jewish families and on lesbian, gay, bi, and transsexual families. Any stats either from the city's samples or from others about the impact of the impact of those of religion and sexuality on access to childcare and the way COVID has impacted them? Do we even keep those statistics? Right. Go ahead, Sharon.
That's an interesting point around religion. No, in Raising the Village, we don't have religion. And I think it's probably related to the data sources that we use are not asking that. So I'm tucking that in the back of my head. I think that's a good point. Certainly LGBTQ, where that data is being collected, it's reflected in Raising the Village. The benefit of having this rich resource and having it as a baseline, it means that exactly what Jerry's saying, we can look at the gaps and then we can inform some of the other data sources that we draw from to address those gaps. So thank you, that was a good point.
Another question around, we know that families aren't going to be coming back to the same programs and the families aren't going to be coming back the same. So what sort of investment do we need in addressing the traumas? Not only what sort of investment, but what form should that investment take? What would it look like at the program level in supporting families who are coming back traumatized by what the last 20 months has thrown at them? Was it 20 months or 12 months?
You want me to pick up on this?
Yes, whomever.
Well, I think we can look at the interventions and practices related to addressing adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs, because this is really what we're looking at, right? Our practices need to be now more than ever trauma informed. We knew prior to COVID, we needed to start working on trauma-informed practices. Now, it's non-negotiable. We need to brush up on that. We need to seek out the resources. Certainly, in some of the work that we're doing here at the city, we're preparing to talk about the mental health of our workforce, what to expect, the mental health of children, and how can we provide resources to educators to be able to respond to that new, it's not even a new normal, it's just, with ACEs now is more prevalent more than ever.
Nicole, a question, I'm sorry, Dawn, a question for you. That there has been a, we know that mothers are out of the workforce, but overall, what kind of impact will that have on building back better or economic recovery or whatever we want to call it if mothers can't get back into the workforce or decide not to get back into the workforce? And will childcare be enough? I guess
Yeah,
that's
I
the
mean,
question.
I think childcare is part of the answer. But I think we also know that, it is the case that, as I was discussing earlier, some of the jobs just aren't going to come back. It's going to be different. To Karen's point, new normal, just different. And so we have to think about how do we re-engage these women who, say that schools reopen, everything, they can get that side of the equation, but they don't really have something to come back to. And I think that's where the reskilling, the retraining comes in. And certainly when we've done, as I said in the presentation, when we looked at the past, it was this idea that women were always, according to the way we mapped it out, because of the positions we work in, we're going to be more at risk of automation. So what does that mean? Well, it means that, women have some core skills that they can use as a starting off point to reskill, because it is going to be the case, I think, that when these jobs go, you may just need some additional skills. It doesn't mean that the skills you have are worthless. They certainly are not. They're sort of the foundation. Then you move. So is it more digital skills? And how do you get into that? And I think the governments right now are trying to put in these training programs to have people pick up these micro credentials or whatever skills. Now, some, if in fact early childhood education is going to be a big driver rather in terms of employment gains, like that will take a little more hands-on, and then that also has to be facilitated somehow because people may not be able to afford being out of the labor force for another year to retrain. So we think it's a complicated outlook, but I do think that training is going to be sort of the key, because when we think about our economy, what drives it, well, it's capital, but it's also labor. And as we know, demographics are not our friend at the current time. It is an aging society. We need more and more people to be working for us to be raising our standard of living. If women do take this step back and don't re-engage, it just leaves a lot on the table. We look at one statistic, and this has never happened. But if participation in the labor market for women were the same as men, and that gap's about 7 percentage points, that would be $100 billion every year to our economy and economic output. So there's a lot, on the table here. So, we saw the participation rate gap narrowing. COVID came, threw a monkey wrench into that and kind of messed up that nice trend. Now we just need to see, a narrowing in that gap over time if we are going to reap those benefits. And that's really just good for everyone in the economy.
And that's a good segue into our next question, which deals with the differences in the way people have reacted in Canada and south of the border around restrictions, around making themselves available for vaccines. We didn't have the equivalent of January 6th, for example. So what role, the question is, what role do you think public policy played in helping Canadians, and I'm not even going to use the word, the word's not adjust, she has adjust in quotes, adjust to being in circumstances of COVID?
Well, I think from my point of view, it is going to be, I think, an uphill battle to some degree. I think what we're seeing, we know we've been slower just because of not having manufacturing on site of the vaccines, but we're catching up quite quickly on the first dose anyway. The second dose is going to be a little slower, but it does seem likely that by the end of the summer. But it will be challenging. Will people go in mass transit to the same extent? Will they be willing to go into, big areas where there's lots of people? And so these will, I think, be sort of, I don't know if they're emotional challenges, but there's certainly, I think it's going to create some challenges. Now, I think when we think about the economy and how it's going to open, For some businesses, it'll be more of a hybrid. You won't always be in the office. So that too is going to change it a little bit. But I think that, it is sort of, how are we going to get over that hump to just be more comfortable that we have enough people vaccinated, we have herd immunity. Maybe people wear masks all the time. Hard to say. I mean, I know in the US they are not, but here, that may be something that people are more comfortable with. Hard to say. I have to say that it's still a bit of a head scratcher from the how do we get right back to full tilt for the economy.
Nicole, you had something to add on this?
It wasn't about this. It was actually a couple comments back, but I think it relates to this as well. I think when you're talking about public policy and then relating it to economic sustainability, I think those are important points to consider, but also I feel like we need to stop relying on population density as a way that we provide service in the early childhood sector, particularly. I mean, I'm thinking a lot about what was just spoken about earlier about, these mental health challenges in focusing on those adverse childhood experiences in the early years. Those were happening already. And now our culture is more aware of the mental health concerns that children might be facing. And I think that we actually need to change the ways that policy and our systems function in order to support young children. In particular, I'm thinking about sort of the disability and special needs system. I've done a lot of work talking to families across Canada about their experiences with early childhood disability systems, even in Toronto. And what we see is that those systems largely function on referral basis as well as diagnostic criteria. So when we have actually, pretty much the whole childhood population right now experiencing trauma to some degree, we need to start making those systems function differently, because we are actually going to have a number of children who potentially already had mental health concerns, which have now been exacerbated by COVID-19 or made more apparent as a result of COVID-19, that are going to need long-term sustainable intervention and support. And if we are only relying on sort of diagnostic criteria or the access of professionals who have expertise in that area, there are going to be so many children who are left behind in that regard. And so really, I think it's about thinking about how potentially we can restructure some of these systems to actually address more of what we are seeing, which is more mental health challenges. We need to start thinking about more holistic methods of supporting children and families where they are, rather than only regarding some children as being in this place where they get specialized things elsewhere. In particular, I think disability services, Indigenous services, services for any demographic need to be integrated into a place where communities are actually being reflected in the systems that are in their environments.
Thank you. And that does lead us right into our next question, which is what role family support programs can play in addressing some of the more egregious outcomes of the pandemic, which goes from everywhere, from mental health issues to real hunger that families are experiencing. I mean, we talk about, when we talk about childcare, we often think of group childcare, but there's a continuum of resources that are supposedly available to families, which may be well suited to address some of those issues. So Karen, now that the city is responsible not only for childcare, but for family support programs like early on, so how are they being integrated into responding to what families are confronting now, particularly as more and more families aren't able to send their children to childcare or don't feel comfortable sending their children to childcare?
And early on programs or child and family support programs, they're right in families' homes now. So that gives us a great window of opportunity. Lots of families are participating virtually. those programs have also pivoted to one-on-one consultation phone calls, because if you're not in childcare, your child's at home, you still have all those issues going on. So we were lucky enough in the city of Toronto to have a public health nurse support the sector. Right. And it goes back to what Nicole is saying. It's about a holistic approach and knowing your community. So we knew what this group of parents, families were experiencing: raising the village, inequities, loss of job, mental health. So we do a ton of work with public health. They're available for families. They're also available for the workforce as well. We had Bereavement of Ontario come and do workshops because grief is real in the community. Again, you know, I just want to go back to what Nicole said: holistic, knowing your community. And I think that's been the benefit of the early on centers, because they're so close to the ground and connected. And in addition, knowing that some families don't have access, what do you need? They need iPads. So come and take out an iPad, borrow an iPad. Food security, program supplies. They're actually going door to door, contactless drop off, food and arts and crafts. And so they're on the ground with the community because they know their community.
Thank you. So our next question is, what role can ECE training play in addressing the trauma of the pandemic? So this is something that would go, you know, both for preparing, the next entrance into the childcare sector. What kind of pre-service training are they getting? And also, what can be done in order to support educators who are both working now and are looking at coming back?
I could approach this. I was thinking, I teach early childhood at Ryerson, and a number of my students over the course of this year felt very much, I think similarly to what was shared about families, similarly are nervous to re-enter or enter for the first time, potentially, the early childhood sector. And I think the more that I spoke with my students about mental health practices and ways that as ECEs, they are actually well positioned to be supporting mental health outcomes, the more they felt empowered to be able to go into childcare settings. I think the issue when we're thinking about particularly mental health, but any type of specialized service in early childhood, we still have a pervasive medical model in the early years where we require specialists to diagnose and prescribe interventions, when early childhood educators are actually well-positioned, well-trained, and know their community enough to be able to respond to the needs of children. And so I think there needs to be a sort of demedicalization of mental health and depatholization. Oh, I can never get that one right. Depatholize, you know what I'm saying, of mental health, because we're all struggling, right? Like all of us are having our own stuff come up as a result of COVID. And so we need to actually spread the load a little bit in terms of how we can respond. Not to say that ECEs will be doing diagnoses or that they will be doing, very intensive therapies, but that they are actually well positioned to be doing some of that work, enough that we can get a larger portion of children to have access to some mental health skills training. Like learning about breath work, learning about mindfulness. Those kinds of practices need to be embedded into our education system rather than an ad hoc specialty kind of thing that people do outside of an ECE training program. And I think really that gets back to that conversation again about wages and positions, because the more ECEs become educated, the less and less they want to actually stay in the system because it's not sustainable for them and doesn't match their expertise. And so we actually need to start thinking about ECEs as being not only childcare workers, but also educators, also mental health workers, also all of these kinds of support people that are really integral to early childhood development.
So Dawn, I think this takes us to your area of expertise. I mean, there are certainly women's jobs that can be automated, but I don't see anyway how we are going to automate childcare or elder care. You know, those sorts of things. They need human contact, and these are because both our demographics are aging, and because we need young parents in the workforce. These seem to be growth jobs.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and that is one of the things, and that's why it is that getting the person who is displaced, but obviously have to change their skills mix. They have to be trained on whatever it happens to be, whether it's the children or the seniors, because as you say, the care sector it's where the demand is going to continue to be growing, especially if we do have a national child care program. But also, as we said, the demographics, there's just going to be many more seniors who are going to need not necessarily all kinds of care, but certainly some degree of care as we go forward. So definitely when we look at that, when we were looking back at the skills and what women, you know, because they were in these other industries, you know, could they pivot and do these different things? I mean, it does require, though, the ability to have some training. And the ability to do that, you know, it also is a time cost for the person. Can they actually, you know, somehow have time to do that? But it's also a funding cost. So it is something I think we have to be mindful is we know the demand is there, it's going to persist, and quite likely, as you say, pick up. But again, it's getting us in position to take these people who, you know, and again, the idea that people have multiple jobs, you know, you don't really, it's harder to move up in your career. You know, I go to these things with women in leadership, and you're kind of like, well, if I have multiple jobs, how do I ever move up in either one of them? You know, how do I get on this? And we've done work in the past looking at how instead of jobs, you know, women over the past 25 years have developed careers. You know, they have attachment to the labor market. They want to be on a career path. So it's all of these things, you know, trying to get people in positions where they're settled and they're able to move up towards more senior leadership roles, having more input into strategies as we go forward. So I think, you know, again, it's that it is going to be, I think, you know, we're gonna have a mismatch for a bit. And so we need to get, you know, that skills, getting those two, supply and demand linking up.
Right. So one of the trends that we've seen across the country is that in order to deal with labor shortages in the early childhood workforce, you know, regulations have been changed, or they're on the table to be changed, that you just don't need those. You don't need those specific qualifications. Nicole, how important is it to actually, you know, for somebody who teaches people for this area, how important is it to come into the field with that pre-service training?
I think this is like the fundamental question of a difference of opinion of what childcare is and early childhood education, because childcare serves the function of maintaining the economy. It allows people to go to work and children to be tended to, whereas early childhood education is really about prioritizing early years as a particular area of growth and development that we want to capitalize on, or you know, that we see value in actually having really intentional ways of teaching and engaging. And to know that difference, I think you do need to have training that really prioritizes that understanding of childhood as a life space that is integral to not only long-term outcomes, but to actually the well-being of society. And so sometimes we get into kind of these discussions about childcare or the early years as being a process for families to operate into the rest of the world without seeing children as being part of that world. And early childhood education is really a place where we understand that that is actually integral to our society, not only because they become future adults, but that children are actually integral to our society. And so, you know, in Indigenous cultures, we really value children as being a life space that is really close to our spiritual processes. And really the ways that Indigenous communities would structure early childhood education is that our whole communities are actually created to support children. And so yes, people do leave and they go elsewhere, but actually the community takes care of the children. And so we have intentional practices around pedagogies, but really children don't move. It's everyone around that moves around the children. And I think especially now, we really need to have early childhood educators who understand trauma-informed practice, who are really intentional about the pedagogies they're using. And when we're thinking about sort of equity, we really need educators to be understanding and acknowledging the inequities of our society and are able to actually create systems where these are on the table. These discussions are part of our curriculum. Young children are not too young to know about residential schooling. They are not too young to understand slavery. These need to be part of our education system. Early childhood isn't just fairy tales and rainbows. And we need to have people who are well trained and well prepared, and also have the support systems in their own lives to be able to provide that care for children.
Yes, I think this is going to be one of our challenges going forward, because there will be a lot of demand. I mean, particularly if the finance minister fulfills her promise to cut fees in half by next year and get it down to around $10 a day within 5 years, there's going to be incredible demand. And I think as policy implementers, there's going to be a real challenge between, whether or not we create places that warehouse children, or whether we create places which provide children and families with a good quality early childhood experience. I'm going to give the panelists 3 minutes each to share their final thoughts with us before we close this section of the Summer Institute. And I'm going to go in the opposite direction to which we started out. So Karen, that means starting with you.
Well, that is the risk, because my dog walker is about to come into the house. Just lighten it up, right? We're all virtual. Who would ever have thought that I have now welcomed over 200 people into my home? So thank you. Welcome to my home. There's the dog walker. Sorry. Bill, I'm doing a presentation. You shouldn't have picked me first. I just want to say, no, you'll have to go to someone. I got to get him out. Here. Okay.
Nicole,
I'm good. Oh, okay. There we go.
And you got your dog shirt on. Don't you have a dog shirt on, or is that a fish shirt?
Yeah, no, it's giraffes. So you know what? I think what I just showed you right now is a very, very, very small part of how this has disrupted our lives, right? I'm fortunate. I get to work from home. I know as through all the data, there are a lot of people that need support. And I think for me, my real message and my priority right now through all of this is making sure we don't return to the same old. Right? We have a golden opportunity when everything has been disrupted, and we know that we have inherent problems, in particularly in the city of Toronto, around equity and access. Here's an opportunity. I think it's incumbent upon us not to ignore the data. And this is what I always say to people. You know, you can read the data, you can read the stats, but once you understand them, you have to do something about it. You cannot ignore the fact. So I'm hoping, you know, with the national childcare plan, that it'll give us the opportunity to really target investments. I think this is a time where we have a universal targeted approach, and everybody needs to be on board. We need to address the inequities. So I would end with that. And very sorry for the interruption with the dog.
No, it brought a little bit of home life to us all. Thank you. Thank you to the doc. Nicole.
Yeah, this has been really interesting. I really appreciated the diversity of perspectives here. I wasn't necessarily expecting, when I saw the panel, I was like, oh, this will be interesting. And it definitely was interesting. I think what I want to leave on today is again, yeah, what Karen said around, I don't want to return. And I don't think that was working, and right now isn't working either, which means we have an opportunity to radically shift the ways that we do things. And for me, that always means returning to what my ancestors have taught me, and what I have learned about equity has come from, my Indigenous knowledges and the ways that we actually prioritize community over individual gain or individual growth. And so, some of the things that I was going to talk about in my initial presentation, but was, really that this isn't meant to be easy. And I think that's why it is so important that we continue to have discussions and have multiple perspectives at the table, because we need to push each other in different directions. We need to account for the complexity of what early years means. And yes, it is a place for families. Yes, it is a place for communities. Yes, it is a place for children. Yes, it is a place for mental health prioritization. Yes, it is a place for education. Like, it is so many things. And because it is so many things, we need to continuously reflect and critically analyze what we are doing. And so when I'm thinking about what that means for equity deserving groups, to use Karen's terminology there, is really to prioritize the needs of those who are least served by the systems. And so for me, Indigenous, Black, immigrant, and disabled families, as well as LGBTQ children and families, are underserved by our early years spaces. And so we need to look to them and be in relation to them to be able to improve our practices. I really think that in terms of what could be done better is really by taking stock of where we are at in real terms, not sugarcoating and not, attempting to erase what's actually happening, understanding that, slavery and cultural genocide is part of our Canadian shared history. And we need to embed that as part of the ways that we move forward, and to engage in decolonization rather than reconciliation, because reconciliation only works if we actually hold each other accountable. But when we do create spaces where decolonization can be enacted, we actually, can foster new possibilities, new structures, and new futures where, we are engaging in more equitable and inclusive practice.
Thank you, Nicole. Dawn, final word.
Well, thank you. I want to first say thank you for inviting me, and I learned so much from this session and really appreciated hearing from Karen and Nicole. It's complicated. Let's put it that way. And in our work, we are looking at it from a different angle. It's more of a macroeconomic lens, and thinking about how we can have everyone contributing to the economy in the way that suits them best, but also that furthers our standard of living as a country. Our work has been to look at how different parts of our economy, our labor market, is being impacted by COVID-19, and really just in trying to ensure that we keep the lens on those that are at the greatest risk of being left behind. Because we know that the longer people are out, the further they get away from their networks and further development of their skills, it takes longer, and some people don't ever come back. So it is a question of really keeping a very keen eye. Obviously, early childhood education is very, very big part of that equation. It helps parents, it helps children, and it helps the future of Canada. So thank you once again. It's been a great delight to be a part of this.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists, and I we'll let you know from the Q&A section of the site. There's many participants that are really grateful that you were able to share your experiences with us, because I know there's nothing that you like more than to have another Zoom call. But to keep that in perspective, tomorrow from 1 till 3 is the second part of the Summer Institute, the Public Advantage of Early Learning and Childcare. And that will be with Karen's colleague, Shanley McAdams, who's the General Manager of Toronto Children's Services, Isabelle Vignette, who's our partner at the University of Montreal, and Maureen Dockendorf, who comes to us from BC. So Quebec and BC are two very interesting models of going forward on early learning and childcare. And to all of our participants, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your very insightful questions. I think it really drew out a very interesting conversation. So until tomorrow, stay safe and thank you. Bye-bye.